Hey guys, how's it going? Today I'm going to be making a. Well, actually, probably not. Today I'm going to be making it. I probably made it yesterday or several days ago. It depends when I upload this. But a video on 10 things, except it was going to be 10, and then I wrote 10, and then I realized there was another one. So it's going to be like a top 10, but I'm going to count 0 in there. Also, I'm not going to be counting down. I'm breaking all the rules here. So technically 11 things, but it's going to be a top 10 list of lies from British history. And sometimes these aren't lies, they're just misleading things or things from omission. But I would count them as lies insofar as they're things we are told that I think lead to people having misconceptions about history and saying wrong things. Also, just an aside, I'm not even claiming that half these things are even that important. Like, sometimes they're just technicalities, and I'm not suggesting that they have some massive effect on the way that, our culture is now. But, well, I figured I might as well do a top 10 list, because I'm planning on doing another top 10 list after this, which will be more political. Anyway, so first of all, I'm just going to explain roughly how the history system works in the UK, and I'm just going to ignore primary school. Primary school being kind of what you guys would call, some of you aren't you guys, what Americans would call elementary school. And if you're not American or British, then you can just go fuck yourself. Anyway, so I'm just going to ignore that because that doesn't matter. So I'm going to mostly focus from Key Stage 3, which is kind of middle school for Americans, to A-level, which is sort of graduation-ish time for Americans. And quick side note there, we have a different system in a lot of ways, and all you really need to know is that during GCSE you don't have to take history, and during A-level you really don't have to take history, but quite a few people do. It's usually the most popular subject, so there's that. Anyway, so Key Stage 3, we start off, the first year I did, and also I should clarify, this will be different for everyone, but the first year I did the medieval era from 1066 to the Tudors. If you don't know why 1066 is an important date in British history, then I don't even know what to do with you. Then Tudor era, and this is in year 8, Tudor era, English Civil War and Victorian society. Also, pretty sure at some point during all of that we watched Roots, but I can't really remember when. And then year 9, British voting reform, World War I and World War II. Then GCSE, Hitler's Germany, the Cold War, and British World War I propaganda. British World War I propaganda sounds oddly specific. It was part of a thing called can't think of the word for it. A controlled assessment. And a controlled assessment is basically when sort of the lesson itself is part of your grade thing. It's quite complicated. Anyway, then the year after that, or A-level, we did Hitler's Germany, the USA 1890 to 1945, Britain 1951 to 2007, and the US Civil Rights Movement. That's all you really need to know, and something you'll quickly notice is that most of these points will be about World War I and World War II. The other thing you might have noticed if you were paying attention while I read most of that is that we have done quite a bit on World War II, and World War I. And other than that, mostly just British history and some American history. So there's that. Number 1. No, wait, sorry, I need to do my number 0 first. So the number 0 thing that I think people do is they stress the Magna Carta's importance. The Magna Carta wasn't that big a deal, actually. Really didn't change that much in the way that Britain worked. And we generally like to see it as our new constitution, or our version of the constitution. A new constitution that's incredibly old, but only recently, since we started becoming so Americanized in our perceptions, have we felt any need to view it as a constitution. I don't know why. I'll link to an article that explains why it's not that important. I'll probably try to link to articles explaining why most of these things are wrong. except for the obvious ones. Speaking of which, number 1. The Protestant Reformation happened because Henry VIII wanted to get divorced. This is just the result of the fact that we learn about the Reformation because it was quite important during the Tudor period. But we don't learn, despite how much we learn about Germany, we don't learn about the actual Reformation. Meaning that for most people, when they're studying history in the UK, the first time, chronologically, that the word Protestant is mentioned is Henry VIII established the Protestant Church in England because he wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon. Obviously, if you know anything about history, you'll know that's not true. Number 2, the irrelevance of 19th century prime ministers. Yeah, again, this is just a thing that's implied by the way the lesson works, because we usually learn about history from the perspective of kings and queens, and in this case we learn about the 19th century, or at least the latter part of it, from the perspective of Queen Victoria. Even though Queen Victoria had relatively little to do with the economic and social decisions that make 19th century Britain worth studying. For some reason, around World War I, and some people have studied the early 20th century, not me though, but I think they also look at it through the perspective of prime ministers. But for me, the first time we ever looked at it from the perspective of prime ministers was in World War I. And before that, it was always this king or this queen. Seems inappropriate to me. Number 3. Women got full voting rights in 1918. No. In 1918, women over the age of 30, and even then with a couple of complications, were given the vote. And it wasn't until 1928, a decade later, that women got to vote on the same terms as men. Number 4. World War I started because Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated. Political leaders were assassinated on the regular, and political strife in the Balkans was nothing new. No, nobody really expected the assassination to result in a war until it became apparent that it was actually going to result in a war. Just with the Henry VIII divorce thing, the reasons for the conflict are mostly about Germany, and far too complicated, and you don't learn about them in history, even though you probably should. Number 5. We're just on World War I and World War II now, by the way. Number 5. The trench warfare was pointless and the Somme was a failure. So this is classic World War I bad history, and in general the reasons for World War I are left ambiguous, the objectives of the powers are left ambiguous, and the logistics of the fronts are left ambiguous. A few things that need to be said about World War I. 1. The majority of casualties in the war were from artillery, which occurred when sat in trenches rather than running across no man's land. 2. Generals frequently sent small patrols out to no man's land and were fully aware of the benefits to launching small-scale assaults. And 3. The Somme was necessary to stop the French losing Verdun and losing the war. If you want to know more about why trench warfare and running across no man's land and the Somme and things like that actually were sensible military tactics and not just sending men into machine gun fire, for shits and giggles, then read a link below that will probably be about that. Number 6. The Germans had no idea how badly they were losing the war. Now this one is technically true, because the majority of Germans did believe they were winning war, but the thing is, it's often portrayed as like, stupid Germans, they didn't know anything. Their government was lying to them. When really, no. Germany had already achieved their main military objectives of the war, which was to force a Russian surrender. Germany gained most of contemporary Poland from Russia and most of Lithuania and Latvia. They also forced Russia to abandon Finland, the Baltic states, Belarus and Ukraine. The main reason why World War I occurred was not because of the assassination of Franz Duke Ferdinand, but rather because of German military concerns about the potential power of an industrialized Russia. By 1965, Germany was already clearly beating their main rival in the war, which was Russia. The reasons for their surrender against the Western Allies are complicated, but on the subject of their surrender, number 7, the Treaty of Versailles was a harsh treaty that can be blamed for starting World War II. Simply put, no. Fascism can be blamed for starting World War II. The only sense in which the Treaty of Versailles can be blamed for starting World War II lies in the fact that it wasn't strict enough. France had been devastated by this war, they would have to invest huge amounts of effort into reaching the position they were in 1914. Their industry and agriculture had been fucked and their manpower depleted. Britain wasn't that much better off. Germany, by contrast, engaged in no warfare in their own territory. They still had a perfectly healthy industrial and agricultural infrastructure. Infrastructure that they would purposely run into the ground in order to avoid having to pay the countries they decimated. France, Britain, and Russia were incredibly weak in 1919, and they wouldn't fully recover by 1939. Germany left World War I with her industry intact and the highest GDP in Europe. Also, let's not forget what Germany did to Russia in their peace negotiations. 8. Hitler was an economic and strategic genius. No, fucking no. The Nazi Party had shit economic policies and shit military policies. Nazi Germany's military policies were so shit that there are very few feasible hypotheticals where they could have won the war even possibly. 9. The average German wasn't a racist. They were. They voted for a racist party. They hated Jews. Of course they were racist. 10. Dresden, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were basically the worst war crimes committed during World War II. To the credit of the education system, no one's ever actually said this, but in my history classes people speak about the immorality of bombing civilian targets in Japan and Germany as if they were worse than the Holocaust, just in terms of the emotional fervour with which they criticise it. Also, people seem to think bombing was done for fun. Again, links down below if you want to know the benefits of the Dresden bombings in particular, and I might be able to find something about Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Either way, it's all about that sort of wanting to criticise Britain because no, it's wrong to teach children that there's one right answer and one wrong answer. Except there is. Germany and Japan were horrible. They committed horrible war crimes, and no amount of talking about the number of French women who were raped by American soldiers, or whether or not Dresden was unnecessary, or whether or not the Treaty of Versailles was unfair. None of that should gain that much attention when you're talking about a conflict in which 11 million people, or is it 9 million, something like that, were killed intentionally in an industrialized genocide. It seems to me that the British education system, particularly with regards to Germany, wants us to ponder the idea of whether Germany really was a bad guy. And the answer is that they were. And it's annoying how so many students can study Germany in such detail in the British education system and not come away with the message that they were completely evil. And to close on a point, because people say this all the time and it's annoying, history is not written by the victor. It's usually written by whining losers who want to make excuses after the fact. And that's why, if we want to actually teach students history, we should probably make sure that the history we're teaching them is actually true and not just trying to defend a second option bias agenda. Ta-ra!